Hello everyone, and welcome back to Immortal History. Today we're diving into a story that frankly sounds like something out of a historical comedy sketch, but trust me, it's all true. We're talking about a war, a real war, that lasted barely a month, fundamentally reshaped a part of Europe, and yet, incredibly, its most famous moment involves a general, a basket of fruit, and a rather cheeky note to his queen. Not just any fruit, mind you, but oranges. Yes, you heard that right, oranges. In 1801, with the Napoleonic storm already brewing across the continent, Spain, egged on by a very eager Napoleon Bonaparte, decided it was time to flex its muscles. 80,000 Spanish soldiers, a truly formidable force for the time, marched right into neighboring Portugal. It was a campaign that was swift, yes, but also undeniably bloody in places. And when the dust settled, what did we have? A new treaty, a redrawn border, and, believe it or not, that infamous basket of citrus that gave the entire conflict its rather delicious yet utterly baffling name. So settle in, because this, my friends, is the War of the Oranges. Now, to truly understand how we ended up with a War of the Oranges, we need to zoom out a bit and look at Europe in 1801. And let me tell you, it was basically a group project gone wrong, with everyone fighting over who got to lead and who wasn't pulling their weight. The French Revolution had, in essence, shattered the old order, and Napoleon Bonaparte, rising from the chaos, was busy redrawing the map with his military genius and sheer force of will. Europe was a continent in constant flux, a chessboard where alliances shifted faster than you could say "Vive l'Empereur." At the heart of this continental struggle were two titans, Britain and France. They were already at each other's throats, locked in a relentless struggle for dominance. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, understood that Britain's power was rooted in its formidable navy and, crucially, its global trade network. So his grand strategy, even at this early stage, was to hurt Britain where it truly felt it, in its wallet. He figured the easiest way to cripple the island nation was to starve it of trade, to close off every port on the continent to British ships, an early precursor to what would later become his infamous continental system. And then there was Portugal. Now, if you look at a map, Portugal is tiny, almost an afterthought compared to the behemoths surrounding it. But don't let its size fool you. It was stubborn, and crucially, it was Britain's oldest ally. We're talking about an alliance, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, that stretched all the way back to 1373 with the Treaty of Tagilde, and solidified with the Treaty of Windsor in 1386. This wasn't just some casual diplomatic handshake, it was a pact of perpetual friendship, reinforced over centuries, that had seen both nations support each other through thick and thin. For Britain, Portugal represented vital Atlantic ports, crucial for naval operations and trade routes, especially for goods coming from its vast colonial empire. So Napoleon, with his strategic eye scanning the map, saw Portugal sticking out like a sore thumb, a British lifeline right on the Iberian Peninsula, a gaping hole in his envisioned continental blockade. And as was his style, he didn't mince words. He basically turned to Spain, his somewhat reluctant ally, and delivered an ultimatum. Deal with them, or I will deal with you. It was a classic Napoleonic move. Use a proxy, exert pressure, and achieve your goals without directly committing too many of your own resources. Spain's Prime Minister at the time was Manuel Godoy, a figure as ambitious as he was controversial. Godoy, often referred to as the Prince of Peace, a title he earned for negotiating peace with France earlier, was certainly no stranger to political maneuvering. He was eyeing territory, especially the long-disputed Olivenza, and let's be honest, he was also very keen on securing royal favor, particularly with Queen Maria Luisa, with whom he was widely believed to have a rather close relationship. So, you can imagine, he needed no second invitation from Napoleon. The stage was well and truly set for a very short, but as we'll soon discover, a very strange war. Spring of 1801 rolls around, and French diplomats, with Napoleon's authority behind them, arrive in Lisbon with what amounted to a diplomatic laundry list for Portugal. The demands were clear, stark, and utterly non-negotiable. Portugal was to immediately close all its ports to British ships, seize any British vessels currently docked, and essentially betray its best and oldest customer and ally. This wasn't just about trade. It was a direct assault on Portugal's sovereignty and its long-standing foreign policy. To comply would be to sever centuries of economic and political ties and to become, in essence, a pawn in Napoleon's grand design against Britain. Portugal understandably stalled. This wasn't a decision they could make lightly. On one hand, they faced the immediate, overwhelming military might of France and Spain right on their border. On the other, they had their ancient alliance with Britain, a lifeline for their economy and a crucial counterweight to Spanish power. The Portuguese court was likely hoping for a miracle, perhaps for British intervention or for Napoleon's attention to be diverted elsewhere. They tried to buy time, to negotiate, to find any way out of this impossible bind. But Godoy, ever eager to please his French overlord and pursue his own ambitions, wasn't interested in waiting. He wasted no time assembling a formidable Spanish force, a massive army of some 80,000 troops to be precise. And he didn't just plan a single thrust. He orchestrated a multi-pronged invasion, dividing his forces into three main columns, each designed to penetrate Portugal from a different angle. One column was to push through the rugged northeast, a challenging terrain that would test any army. Another was to advance down the Minho River, utilizing natural waterways as a potential logistical advantage. And the largest, the bulk of his army, was to march straight across the breadbasket of Extremadura, aiming directly for the heart of Portugal's border defenses. The message from Spain, backed by the implicit threat of Napoleon's legions, was simple, brutal, and utterly unambiguous. Move or be moved. On the morning of May 20th, 1801, the Spanish invasion officially began. Godoy, leading the main force, crossed the frontier at Olivença, a town that had been a point of contention between Spain and Portugal for centuries. What happened next set the tone for much of the initial campaign. The Portuguese garrison at Olivença, probably outnumbered and poorly prepared, took one look at the vast Spanish host arrayed against them and, without firing a single shot, surrendered. It was a swift, almost bloodless victory, and it sent a clear signal of Spanish intent and Portuguese vulnerability. Town after town along the border seemed to fold in a similar fashion. Jurumenha, Aronches, Campo Mayor. They fell like dominoes, many with minimal resistance, their defenses either incomplete or manned by only a few hundred soldiers, often militias rather than seasoned regulars. It appeared for a moment that Godoy's swift campaign would be an unmitigated triumph, a military parade rather than a bloody war. However, the blitz, as they say, stalled. When the Spanish forces reached the formidable fortress of Elvas, the gates didn't just close, they slammed shut with an air of defiance. Elvas wasn't just any town, it was a heavily fortified city, designed with the latest in military engineering, a testament to centuries of border conflicts. Its defenses were strong, and its garrison, under the command of General Francisco de Noronha, was prepared to fight. For 2 weeks, the plains surrounding Elvas became a killing field. Portuguese guns, reinforced by British-supplied artillery, rained down on the Spanish besiegers, repelling their assaults and turning the tables on Godoy's rapid advance. Godoy found himself in a strategic bind. He couldn't break Elvas. The fortress was too strong, its defenders too determined. And crucially, he couldn't simply bypass it either. To leave such a powerful stronghold in his rear would be an act of military folly, exposing his supply lines and his advancing army to constant threat. The Spanish troops, after their initial easy victories, were now bogged down in a costly siege, their momentum gone. The swift invasion, the easy conquest, had hit a very hard wall, and the Prince of Peace was now facing a bloody stalemate. Campo Mayor, another fortified town, also resisted fiercely for 17 days, further tying down significant Spanish forces and highlighting the resilience of Portuguese defenses when properly manned. It was during this frustrating stalemate, while the siege of Elvas dragged on, that the war earned its peculiar and enduring nickname. Godoy, perhaps growing impatient with the lack of progress, or perhaps just needing a moment of levity amidst the grim reality of siege warfare, decided to make a rather theatrical gesture. he rode through the sun-drenched orchards just outside Elvas, the very orchards that bordered the unyielding fortress, and personally plucked a few ripe, vibrant oranges from the trees. Now, this wasn't just a casual act. He carefully dispatched these oranges to Queen Maria Luisa in Madrid, accompanied by a note that was dripping with confidence, if not outright arrogance. The message, as legend has it, declared something to the effect of, "From the gardens of Elvas, soon from those of Lisbon." It was a cocky boast, a promise of imminent, total victory, implying that just as he had easily gathered these fruits from Portuguese soil, he would soon be gathering the spoils of war from the capital itself. This gesture, as you can imagine, became instant fodder for the court gossips. Madrid was a hub of intrigue and rumor, and a story like this, involving the powerful Prime Minister and the Queen, spread like wildfire. The name War of the Oranges began to stick, first in whispered conversations, then in more public discourse. Newspapers across Europe, ever hungry for a catchy headline and a good story, latched onto it. They mocked Godoy, dubbing him the Orange Conqueror, highlighting the almost absurd, yet strangely poetic nature of his boast. In less than a sentence, fruit, simple citrus, had become potent propaganda. It wasn't just a symbolic message to the Queen, it was a declaration of intent, a psychological weapon aimed at both the Portuguese and the Spanish populace. For the Spanish, it was meant to inspire confidence and national pride. For the Portuguese, it was a humiliating threat, a symbol of their impending subjugation. And for history, it was the moment a minor border conflict became immortalized with a name that still intrigues us today. By early June, a little over 2 weeks into the campaign, it was clear that Godoy's initial momentum had completely evaporated. Spain held a slice of Portuguese territory, yes, having secured several border towns, but their grand advance had ground to a halt. They simply could march no farther. The main core of the Portuguese regular army, though initially caught off guard, had regrouped. Reinforced by local militia units and, crucially, continuously supplied by their steadfast British allies, they managed to block the main roads and strategic passes, forming an effective defensive line. The terrain itself, with its natural choke points and fortified positions, also played a significant role in favoring the defenders. Adding to Godoy's woes was the conspicuous absence of promised French troops. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, had initially pledged support, but his attention, as it so often did, had already shifted. He was already in the process of redeploying his forces toward Italy, where new strategic opportunities and challenges awaited him. For Godoy, this was a bitter pill to swallow. He had been left to prosecute a war that was ostensibly for Napoleon's grander aims, largely on his own. The much-anticipated French reinforcements never arrived, leaving the Spanish army stretched and isolated in Portuguese territory. At this point, both sides realized they had pushed about as far as pride and politics would allow. For Spain, further advances would be costly, prolonged, and potentially disastrous, especially without French backing. For Portugal, while they had managed to halt the Spanish advance, their resources were finite and the specter of a full-scale French invasion still loomed if they pushed too hard. It was a classic stalemate, where the military objectives had become unattainable for the aggressor, and the defender had achieved enough to negotiate from a position of relative, albeit precarious, strength. The war had reached an impasse, and the time for diplomacy, however reluctant, had arrived. With the military campaign effectively stalled, the focus shifted from the battlefield to the negotiating table. On June 6th, just 17 days after the initial invasion, negotiators from Spain and Portugal, with French representatives lurking in the background, met to hammer out a peace treaty. And in a touch of historical irony, where did they meet? Inside the very fortress of Badajoz, a Spanish city mere miles from Elvas, which had been at the heart of the conflict and had been shelled just days earlier. The ink was barely dry on the peace agreement before the sounds of cannons had faded. The resulting document was known as the Treaty of Badajoz, and it laid out several key provisions that would significantly impact Portugal. Firstly, and perhaps most enduringly, Portugal agreed to formally hand over the town of Olivenza to Spain. This wasn't just a minor border adjustment, it was the formalization of a long-standing territorial claim by Spain. To this day, Olivenza remains Spanish, a testament to this brief war, although Portugal still disputes its sovereignty, often printing it on maps with dotted lines, a clear visual representation of an unresolved historical grievance. Secondly, and this was the core demand from Napoleon, Portugal pledged to close every single one of its ports to British ships. This was a direct blow to Britain's trade and naval strategy, and a clear victory for Napoleon's continental ambitions. However, and this is where the pragmatism of geopolitics comes into play, enforcement of this clause was, shall we say, conveniently lax once the ink on the treaty had dried. Portugal, deeply reliant on its trade with Britain and unwilling to completely alienate its powerful ally, often turned a blind eye to British vessels, demonstrating the limits of French influence when faced with economic realities. Thirdly, Portugal was forced to pay France a rather fat indemnity, a significant sum of money that essentially served as a war reparation, and to grant special trade perks to Spanish merchants. These economic concessions further cemented French and Spanish influence over Portugal's economy, turning it into a less independent player on the European stage. In return for these significant concessions, Spain packed up its armies and went home. The war, a mere 17 days of active campaigning, was officially over. A swift, decisive, and somewhat bizarre conflict had concluded, but its consequences, as we'll see, would reverberate for years to come. The War of the Oranges might have been short, but its aftermath was anything but simple, and the irony of its outcomes is truly striking. Olivenza, as we've discussed, officially swapped flags, becoming Spanish territory. But the bigger, more profound change was psychological, altering the perceptions and relationships across the Iberian Peninsula and beyond. Spain, under Godoy's leadership, felt emboldened. The swift victory, however limited, seemed to affirm its military strength and its renewed alliance with France. It gave Madrid a false sense of security and power, making them believe they could navigate Napoleon's ambitions to their own advantage. This newly found confidence, however, would prove to be a dangerous illusion. Portugal, on the other hand, felt a deep sense of betrayal. Forced to yield territory and compromise its ancient alliance with Britain, the experience was humiliating. It highlighted their vulnerability and the harsh realities of being a small nation caught between powerful empires. This feeling of betrayal would linger, shaping their future decisions in the face of Napoleonic expansion. And Britain? Well, Britain realized that its oldest friend on the continent, its vital strategic partner, could be bullied. The ease with which Portugal was pressured exposed a weakness in their continental strategy and underscored the urgent need to protect their interests in the region more directly. This realization would have profound consequences, as we'll soon discover. Because, and here's the ultimate irony, within just 6 years the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically. The very alliances and pressures that led to the War of the Oranges would come back to bite Spain. Napoleon, not content with merely using Spain as a proxy, would invade both Spain and Portugal in 1807, launching what became the brutal and protracted Peninsular War. The Orange Senders of 1801, the Spanish, would become the occupied victims of tomorrow, their country plunged into a devastating conflict against their former French ally. The Peninsular War, a conflict that lasted for years and killed hundreds of thousands, would make the War of the Oranges look like nothing more than a minor food fight. It was a truly catastrophic event that would reshape the entire region, a stark reminder that in the grand game of empires, today's ally can quickly become tomorrow's enemy, and a small victory can often lead to a much larger, more terrible defeat. So what are we left with from this brief, peculiar conflict? The legacy of the War of the Oranges, despite its short duration, is surprisingly multifaceted and continues to echo in various ways, even today. Olivenza, that small border town, remains Spanish territory, as agreed in the Treaty of Badajoz. However, Portugal, as we touched upon earlier, has never officially recognized this cession. On Portuguese maps, you'll still often find Olivenza marked with dotted lines, a silent but persistent assertion of a territorial claim that dates back over 2 centuries. It's a fascinating example of how historical disputes, even seemingly minor ones, can linger in national consciousness and official cartography. While not a source of active conflict, it's a constant reminder of past grievances. Culturally, the memory of the war, and particularly its colorful name, has endured. Festivals on both sides of the border, especially in the regions affected by the conflict, often feature orange-themed souvenirs and celebrations. It's a way of commemorating a shared history, even if from different perspectives, and of embracing the quirky narrative that surrounds the war. School kids in both Spain and Portugal learn about this unusual conflict, perhaps chuckling at the idea that wars can start over weighty treaties and geopolitical maneuvers, but end up being named after something as mundane as a basket of snacks. It's a story that highlights the human element, the absurd alongside the tragic in the grand sweep of history. For historians and political scientists, the War of the Oranges is often cited as a textbook example of coercive diplomacy. What does that mean exactly? Well, it's when a powerful state uses the threat or limited application of military force to compel a weaker state to comply with its demands, rather than engaging in a full-scale, devastating war. In this case, Napoleon used Spain as his instrument to force Portugal to align with French interests. It was a small war, big message. A brief, targeted campaign designed to achieve specific strategic objectives without getting bogged down in a prolonged conflict. It demonstrated that sometimes a show of force, even a symbolic one like a basket of oranges, can be enough to redraw borders and shift alliances, often with far greater efficiency than the bloody, protracted wars that characterized much of the Napoleonic era. So what became of the key players in this orange-scented drama? Their lives, as is often the case with historical figures, took various turns, some more dramatic than others. Manuel Godoy, the Prince of Peace and Orange Conqueror, saw his star, which had shone so brightly during the War of the Oranges, gradually fade with the Spanish monarchy he served. His political fortunes were inextricably linked to King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa. As Napoleon's influence in Spain grew, and as the Spanish populace became increasingly discontent with Godoy's perceived corruption and subservience to France, his power waned. Ultimately, he fell from grace during the tumultuous events leading up to the Peninsular War, forced into exile, where he lived out the remainder of his days. His memoirs, written in his later years, are, as you might expect, full of justifications for his actions, an attempt to reframe his legacy and absolve himself of blame for Spain's misfortunes. It's a classic example of a historical figure trying to control their narrative long after the fact. Queen Maria Luisa, the recipient of Godoy's infamous oranges, also met a rather less than glamorous end. She died in exile in Rome, her life a far cry from the opulent Spanish court she once dominated. She's buried, rather poetically, under a marble cherub, and it's said that occasionally sarcastic tourists, perhaps remembering the tale of the oranges, will leave a piece of citrus fruit on her tomb. It's a poignant, slightly humorous, and very human reminder of how even queens can be remembered for the most unexpected and trivial of historical footnotes. And what of the stage upon which this particular act of history unfolded? The Elvas fortress, that stubborn bastion that defied Godoy's siege, still stands proudly today. It's recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a testament to its formidable military architecture and its strategic importance. When you visit, guides well aware of the story's charm often love to end their tours with a flourish, pointing to the surrounding orchards and declaring, with a knowing smile, "And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where the oranges came from." It's a tangible link to a story that, despite its brevity, captured the imagination and secured its place in the annals of history. So after all this talk of fruit and fleeting campaigns, why does the War of the Oranges truly matter? Beyond its quirky name and memorable anecdote, what deeper lessons can we draw from this seemingly minor conflict? Firstly, the War of the Oranges reminds us quite powerfully that geopolitics often hides behind theatre. The basket of fruit, the quick surrender of towns, the relatively low casualties, these were the superficial elements, the theatre that masked a much more profound shift in power and influence. A few cannonades, a symbolic gesture, and a swiftly signed treaty can, in fact, redraw borders and reshape national destinies faster than many of the larger, bloodier wars that dominate our history books. It highlights how political will, combined with strategic pressure, can achieve significant outcomes with surprisingly limited direct military engagement. It's a demonstration that not all wars are won on grand battlefields with hundreds of thousands of casualties. Sometimes the psychological and diplomatic maneuvers are just as, if not more, effective. Secondly, and perhaps most crucially, this conflict serves as an early preview of the Napoleonic tactic of using allies as proxies. Napoleon, even at this stage of his career, was a master strategist. He understood the value of leveraging other nations' resources and ambitions to further his own agenda. Instead of committing his own precious French troops to every front, he skillfully pressured Spain to do his bidding, to fight his battles and to absorb the political fallout. This was a pattern he would repeat throughout his campaigns, a precursor to the larger continental shakeup that was to come. It's a chilling demonstration of how powerful nations can manipulate weaker ones, turning them into instruments of their own imperial designs. The War of the Oranges, therefore, isn't just a quirky footnote. It's a microcosm of the Napoleonic era, a brief but potent illustration of the strategic thinking, the shifting alliances, and the often cynical power plays that defined that tumultuous period. It shows us how seemingly small events can have significant ripple effects, setting the stage for much larger conflicts and fundamentally altering the course of history. So the next time you peel an orange, savoring its fresh, zesty aroma, I hope you'll spare a thought for the rather extraordinary 1801 invasion that lasted barely a month, profoundly reshaped the Iberian Peninsula, and earned its utterly unforgettable nickname because a general, Manuel Godoy, flirted with royalty via Citrus Express. It's a tale that reminds us that history doesn't always taste sweet, with grand victories and heroic sacrifices, but sometimes it sure smells zesty, full of unexpected flavors and surprising twists. Thank you so much for watching. If you learned something new, something that made you go, "I never knew that," then please like the video, subscribe to the channel for more historical deep dives, and drop a comment below telling us about the weirdest war name you've ever heard. I'm always on the lookout for more bizarre historical gems. See you in the next one. No fruit required, just your curious minds.